everyone. Welcome. I would say spring is coming, but not this weekend. Let me tell you a little bit about Elise. Elise Guyette is a historian, author, and educator with a passion for discovering and teaching about stories that were lost because of the traditional telling of history from the point of view of the powerful. Dr. Guyette co-founded the Burlington Edible History Tour, which told the stories of various Burlington immigrant groups along with their food traditions and food businesses. That sounds interesting. Her publications include Vermont, a cultural patchwork, and Discovering Black Vermont, for which she was awarded the Richard O. Hathaway Prize for outstanding contributions to the field of Vermont history. She is presently working to start the Burlington History and Culture Center to fill in a gap in the city's historical offerings. Please give a warm welcome to Elise Guyette. Where are you? Here you are.
So thank you so much, and this is great. We're going to get you home before the snow starts tonight. Everybody will be tucked away at home by the time that, I thought March was supposed to go out like a lamb. I don't know, what whole world is turning upside down. So I entitled my talk, The Jagged Edges of Progress, because I think our progress really is jagged. That blue line on the top is what people often think of when they think of progress. But I think it's because we like to teach the high points. And in between the high points, there are low points. We have victories for humanity, and then we have a backlash. And then we start climbing out of it, the valleys again, and then we have another victory for humanity, and there's pushback, there's backlash. So history is jagged. That blue line at the top doesn't mean anything, except that there are people who want us only to teach those high points. So I'm going to tell the story about these black farmers from Heinsberg, but through this idea, this is a subtext, that they have high points in their lives and they have low points, and it goes with, state and national events. And I think that's history. The black line is history, not the blue line. So let's start with the first black farmer that I discovered who came to Heinsberg, and his name was Shubal Clark. His wife's name was Violet Bassett. So Violet and Shubal moved to Moncton, which is down here. Here's Moncton. It's in Addison County. I know they moved to Moncton, and I know they moved from New Milford, Connecticut, because it said so in the land records. And then 4 years later, I find them moving to Heinsberg right up here, and they bought 100 acres right here. It's on the border between Heinsberg and Huntington. The second black farmer that I discovered was Prince and Samuel Peters. Samuel Peters was never in any census, but he was all over in the town records. And they lived together. Sometimes they lived in the same house, sometimes they lived in different houses, but the houses were on the same piece of land owned by Prince Peters. And Prince Peters' wife was Hannah Lensman. They came to Heinsberg. They came to this, and today the place is called Lincoln Hill in Heinsberg. Back then it was called something else. But so this is like the middle of Heinsberg right here. And this is the road as it starts going up over Lincoln Hill, and you can see that Prince and Samuel Peters lived there, and the road went like this, and then you can see the Clark name here with an E on the end here, and they had 100 acres. Eventually they had over 200 acres, but at first they had 100 acres right here. So those are the main characters of this story that I'm going to tell you. Lewis Clark right here, this L. Clark, is the son of Shubal and Violet. And I can just look at this map and say, oh my gosh, their son has their own farmstead down the road a little ways. That means they were very successful. That means they had made it. Even their son, their children can now buy property and have their own farms. So just by looking at this map, I know that the Clarks did very well. I'm still not sure about the Peters, but I know that the Clarks did by looking at this map. And I can date the map only because It's probably 1830s because I know by the 1830s Lewis Clark had his own farm. Other than that, there was no date on this map, but I loved it. It was an old map. It was all rolled up in the top, way in the back in the corner of the town clerk's office. I don't know if anyone had touched it, since 1830, so it was very exciting to find it. Now, because I knew that Shubal Clark had come from New Milford, Connecticut, I could go to New Milford and find out about his life before he came to Vermont, which is one of the things that I really wanted to know about these folks. So I discovered in the town records there is a man called Partridge Thatcher. His wife was Mary. And Partridge and Mary Thatcher owned African Americans. They enslaved people. And he put it all in the town records. It's fascinating that he did that. He wrote all their births, all their deaths, all their marriages, their emancipations. He wrote all of this in the town records. So I know that there were two children that they called Jacob and Dinah. Who knows what they were named, in their homeland. But we know that Jacob and Dinah, when they were about 10, 11 years old, were forcefully taken from their homes, away from their parents, away from their siblings, away from their aunties and uncles and all of their friends, and brutally thrown in the bottom of a ship and brought to America in the Middle Passage. And we know that they ended up in New Milford, Connecticut. And somehow Jabez Dean of Norwich had these children. He had them for about 6 weeks. And then Partridge Thatcher acquired them, brought them home, and 3 years later they married each other. Now, they were enslaved, so I can't imagine that there was any choice on their part. But they married each other. They eventually had 9 children. One of those children was Sylvia, and Sylvia was the mother of Shubal Clark. All of these people enslaved for decades by the Thatchers. But during the Revolutionary era, more people were freeing enslaved peoples than at any other time in our history other than after the Civil War. So there were a lot of people, when you get into the Revolutionary era, looking at their lives and seeing what hypocrites they were, that they were fighting for freedom and equality, and yet they enslaved peoples. So they were, so here they are, they're married. So Shubal was enslaved when he was younger, but he was freed by Partridge Thatcher in his will. This happened a lot. I want their labor while I'm alive, but after I'm dead, I don't care. So I guess he didn't care about Mary either. I don't know if he discussed this with his wife or not. But anyway, so these folks are now all freed, and this is when Shubal decides to move with his wife Violet to Heinsberg. The Peters, on the other hand, I know a little bit about them too. Prince Peters fought in the Revolutionary War, and this was a real high point for African Americans in this country because they believed what both the Americans and the British told them, that if they fought for them in the Revolution, they would end slavery. Many more people believed the British, black men believed the British and fought for the British, but there were also thousands who fought for the Americans who also believed the Americans would get rid of slavery. Of course, it didn't happen. They were really sorely disappointed that it didn't. But this is a Hessian officer talking about the Hessians were mercenaries paid to fight for the British. This is a Hessian officer saying that no regiment is to be seen in which there are not black men in abundance. And among them are able-bodied, strong, and brave fellows. These were integrated units. There was a black unit from Rhode Island that was an all-black unit, but most of them were integrated. The blacks and whites were fighting together, and they were strong and brave fellows, according to this Hessian officer. And I know that Prince Peters fought. I got it. Can you hear that when my phone dings? Because I put on, wait, I'm going to turn it down, see if that works. I put on an alarm so I would know, so I wouldn't go overtime. Let's hope that does it. So I found this pension from Prince Peters, and this was fascinating because he's in Heinsberg. He says, I'm a farmer, but owing to old age and bodily infirmities, I'm unable to succeed. In these days, you could apply for a pension only if you were unable to succeed. You had to be in really dire straits and really need the help of your government. So the fact that he applied for a pension meant he was on really hard times. And he has 4 children, and that's fascinating. I find their names, I find their ages. And most of them stay around here. One of his sons, Samuel, fought in the War of 1812. Josephus and Sarah, I know a lot about. We can talk about them a little bit later. Electa, I don't know what happened to her. But now Prince Peter's, I don't know if he had been enslaved, but if he had been, he probably was emancipated because of his service in the Revolutionary War. So he also ends up coming up to Heinsberg. And this is a low point. After the Revolutionary War, I mean, people are brokenhearted. They said, we really sacrificed. I mean, it was black people and women saying, we really sacrificed for this war. Where's our reward? We don't get any reward. And so I think some people who came up here, who came to Heinsberg, there was not even a road on Lincoln Hill when they came. This was still virgin forest up there. I think they wanted to be isolated. I think they really just needed to get away and be by themselves up in the wilderness somewhere. And this quote comes from John Lewis, who wrote about Charles Bowles of the Free Will Baptist Church. Charles Bowles was a black minister who lived in Huntington, and he started the first Free Will Baptist Church in Vermont in 1810. And so his biographer says, those who had served so nobly, sacrificed their time and strength in the common cause, were obliged to return to their homes unrewarded. And this is where they decided to come. This is what the setting looks like today. This down here, of course, is ubiquitous stone walls that we see all over Vermont. But I don't think any of us drive around looking at these stone walls saying, oh, black people probably built that, right? We don't say that. But they are. You go onto Lincoln Hill and you're going to see stone walls, and they were built by black people, including that stone wall. This here looks like just a pile of rocks, right? Just a pile of rocks in the woods. But I had asked anthropologists and geographers and archaeologists to walk with me because I'm a historian, I read documents. I needed somebody to help me read the land. And this was fascinating. The archaeologist that was with me that day said, well, look at this. He could see that the dimensions of these rocks form the foundation of a barn. He said, that's a barn foundation. They were all the same. They were all the same dimensions back in those days, so he knew. So I think this is Schubel and Violet's barn foundation. I can go and I can find it. This picture over here is the cemetery. It's not recognizable as a cemetery today because it was destroyed in the 1960s. It was an intact cemetery starting in, I'm trying to think of when the first baby died, very early 1800s. It was an intact cemetery from the very early 1800s to the 1960s. And then in the 1960s, people come along and destroy the entire thing. This right here is a field stone. Probably didn't mean anything to the people who were destroying the cemetery, but a field stone would have been a very early grave marker. So that could be a grave marker. So this is what it looks like today. High points. They got here. They came very heavy-hearted. They wanted to be isolated. But then what happens? They joined the Baptist Church. The Baptist Church records show that Schubel Clark and Violet Clark both joined their church in 1815, 1816. Not only joined it, but Schubel was asked to be on committees. They had committees of 3 people that if you weren't acting the way the Baptists thought you should be acting, the committee would come to your house and they would talk you into coming back to the ways of the church. So Schubel was a real leader in that church. And according to these records, there were also Peters who joined the same church. It's interesting to me that they joined this church and not Charles Bowles' church, the Free Will Baptist Church in Huntington. This church was very, very conservative. They were Calvinists. They believed in predestination. They believed that the way you acted showed whether or not you were saved. They didn't want to have anything to do with those rollicking revivals of the Free Will Baptist Church, because that was not a sign that they were saved. So it's very interesting to me that these folks were very conservative and would have nothing to do with the revivals. And they had revivals around their farm, too, but they wouldn't go to them. They stayed with this church. So we have a biracial church in Heinsberg with biracial committees that would go chastise white people. Unheard of. It's really fascinating that what was happening up on this hill. Then we have, I have a feeling this disappointment turns to hope. That's my interpretation. I'm assuming that they were starting to have some hope. Not only was there a biracial church, there were also voters. I can see them voting every time there's a town meeting. It's in the town records. They're also, they're into the economy of the area. I mean, you can see from this, I found this general store day book at the University of Vermont. It's just sitting somewhere. It's like, this is fascinating. I can look at Heinsberg and see what people were buying and selling. And I found the Clarks and the Peters all over going to buy things. And then I also found this little piece about Matilda Dorsey, who was a white woman, and she bought the butter of Miss Clark and the butter of William Langley. So she knows that butter is an art, and she knows who's making the good butter. And she wants the Clark women's butter. William Langley was not making butter. I can assure you that he was not making butter. It was probably his wife, Elmira Clark. Elmira Clark married William Langley, who came from Pittsford. William moves here. She doesn't go to Pittsford. William moves to Lincoln Hill. And I found that happening over and over and over. When they got married, people went up there. There was something safe going on up there, I think. So here they are, and this is not a picture we think of as Vermont, right? A black woman making butter, and yet they definitely were up on Lincoln Hill. Now this is the next generation. So it says William Langley is going to school. William Langley's not going to school. His children are going to school. He has two. He has two children at the Huntington School, making the school biracial. I don't know what their experiences were, but here they are. They're going to school with all these white kids up in Huntington. After a while, though, the Langley kids are not in the list with everybody else. They're separated out down at the bottom of the record. And it didn't say why they were separated out down there, but it couldn't have been good, right? I don't know what was happening, but I do know what was happening in the wider country. And the wider country is people had to let themselves off the hook of hypocrisy of keeping slavery in this country after the Revolutionary War was over. They realized they were being hypocrites. Founding fathers realized they were being hypocrites. They needed to do something. And what they did was, the philosophy before the Revolutionary War was that people who were not white were definitely inferior, but they were inferior only culturally. And that could be changed. And they did try to change people. They made them Christians. They made them go to church. They were rooting out the culture, and it could be done. By this time, they have to find some other theory so that they don't feel so terrible about keeping slavery alive. And then, so the next theory is, oh no, we were wrong about that. People of color are inferior by blood. It can't be changed. You're born that way. So this became the new theory, and it really, by the 1820s and 1830s, had firmly taken a hold of people's minds in this country. So here's the ideal, the great white man. And the further you get away from that, the more inferior you are. And of course, it's only men. I mean, women didn't even make the chart, right? I don't know where they are. They're like out here somewhere, I guess. So now scientific racism is really taking the hold of people's minds. Now, at the same time this is happening around Heinsberg, around the country, I find this Baptist church record. This is from 1837. And number 9 on the list is Lewis J. Clark. Now, it wouldn't have meant anything to me except many pages before that, I found out that Lewis Clark and his wife Ruth got thrown out of the church. They had one of the committees of 3 come to them, and they said, "You are lodging together, which we think is against the Bible. So we're throwing you out of the church." Now, lodging together against the laws of the church, I don't know exactly what that meant because they were married, they had children. Lewis is black, Ruth is white. Did it mean that? Did it mean they shouldn't be lodging together because there's a biracial marriage? I don't know. There's a lot of biracial things going on up there in Heinsberg. Now, people are always talking about, well, that's a fact. Now, it's a fact that Lewis J. Clark was 9th on the list with over $1,000 in property. That's the fact. My interpretation, then there's the interpretation of the facts, right? My interpretation is, 1837, there's a depression. The church needs money. Let's ask Lewis to come back. That's my interpretation. You can have whatever interpretation you want to, but that's the one I think. And Lewis did come back. It took Ruth 5 years. I think she stayed a little pissed off. 5 years she decided to come back to the church. So here's this other kind of interesting thing happening. At the same time we had the scientific racism, we have colonization starting. Let's send all the free blacks to, Liberia. At the same time that's going on, we have something, when you get real down to it, when you get down on the ground, with relations between people, sometimes things get a little mushy. I never thought I'd find any houses still standing that had anything to do with this community. Found this one. This house is right next to the cemeteries over here. So it's right next to the cemetery. And I looked at it. I must have gone by it a million times until one day I finally said, oh my gosh, take off the porch, take off the additions. What do you got left? Right? You have this cute little cape, right? With an off-center chimney, an off-center door, which is perfect for William Langley and Elmira Clark. They got married about 1826. So this is the right architecture for their house. And it says in the land records that their house was near the cemetery. Sometimes it said east, sometimes it said west. So I was always confused about where this house might be. But then I found this. And it's definitely a very old house. This is the house where Elmira Clark and William Langley lived after they got married and lived up on the hill. They had a son by the name of Loudon Langley. This is now the 3rd generation. And he did a lot of writing. He got a good education in that little Huntington schoolhouse, I tell you. Should read some of his letters, are just wonderful. And one of his letters, he was describing how his family had helped a man who had been enslaved in Cuba. That's kind of mind-blowing, right? I mean, how did a guy from Cuba get to the top of the hill in Heinsberg? Still today is a very rural dirt road. How did he get there? Well, apparently this house was on the Underground Railroad. It has now been, officially put on the list of Underground Railroad houses in Vermont. Not a story we hear a lot, right? Blacks helping blacks. And then because I have that house, I'll show you the Peters house. This is their second house that they built. The first house was out back, and after they built the first house, or the second house, they lived here and they used the other house for firewood. So, you know, good frugal Yankee thing to do, right? So that house is all burned up, but their second house is still there. I think it's all red today. It doesn't look like this. And the Peters were not as successful at farming as the Clarks were. One big reason for that was that the Clarks got 4 hours more of sunlight where they were up at the top of the hill than the Peters got down at the bottom of the hill. So the Clarks were doing very well up on the top of the hill. The Peters needed to supplement their farming with other jobs. And this is a picture of third generation of the Peters men, and they worked for a very wealthy McEwen family. Here they are taking care of the horses. They often took care of the horses. The women sometimes cooked for them. They did odd jobs for the town, fixing fences and things like that. So that's what they were doing. At the top of the hill, and I can make this bigger, I think. Yeah, let me make it a little bigger. So this is the 1860 agricultural census for Heinsberg. And I found Clark's, Williams, Langley's. Clark, this is Violet Clark. She's living with a couple of her sons. Edwin Williams married Phoebe Clark. And then Phoebe Clark died. He married Harriet Clark. So he married 2 Clark sisters. And this is William Langley and Elmira Clark. I assumed that they were up there. They have over 200 acres now up there on the top of the hill. It was worth $3,500. They had 6 cows. The Peters weren't on the census, by the way. The people who got on the census were the people who were really doing well. So the Peters weren't on it. It's another clue that they weren't doing that well in the farming category. So what do they have? They have 6 cows, and they make 1,800 pounds of butter, those 6 cows. They have 8 sheep. They have 32 pounds of wool. And when I first started giving this talk, I'd often have farmers in the audience, and they'd tell me that it's possible to do that, but they had to be really skillful and really intelligent about farming in order to get that much product out of those few animals. So there's another clue that they were doing really well and they knew what the heck they were doing. I like to point out on this one, this 450 pounds of maple sugar. It's not maple syrup, it's sugar. And I wondered why they're making 450 pounds. Anybody have any ideas? Sometimes people have ideas about that one. It's 1860. People are boycotting products made by enslaved people, which includes cane sugar, white sugar from the Caribbean, which is good they boycotted it because it's really poison. You shouldn't be eating cane sugar. Maple sugar is so much better for you. But I think that maybe this family was tapping into that market and selling, their maple sugar. Not sure. It's an interpretation of the facts, right? It's an interpretation of the facts. But I love this down here. They have 4 oxen. So they have 2 teams of oxen. And people often rented them to the neighbors who didn't have any. So there's another way they were making money. So this family, they're doing well up there. Just before the Civil War, they're doing well. Then the Civil War comes along. The Peters stayed on Lincoln Hill up until 1980s was the last piece of property sold by the Peters. The Clarks, on the other hand, who were doing a lot better, were the ones that left. And by the end of the Civil War, they're spread out in other towns. Like Edwin Williams came to South Burlington. Another brother went to Williston. So they scattered and they went to different places. But the Civil War was thought of as the second revolution for black people. The first revolution hadn't worked. They had fought for it, but they had not gotten their freedom. They had not abolished slavery. They said, this is the time. This is our second revolution, and we're going to do it this time. So there were 4 men from Lincoln Hill, 4 black men who went to fight in the Civil War. They initially joined the Massachusetts 54th, which was the first black Northern regiment, not the first black regiment of the Civil War, first black Northern regiment of the Civil War. They get down south and they run into these guys, and they actually did wear red pants for a while. They hated them because the enemy could see them too well in them, and they changed them, but at first they were wearing, this is the South Carolina 1st. They were in the field, armed and fighting before the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was the Emancipation Proclamation that made it legal for black men to fight in the Army, Navy. It was the Emancipation Proclamation. But the South Carolina 1st, and there was also one in Louisiana and one in Kansas. There were 3 black regiments already fighting in the war at the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Langley guys get down there, and Loudon Langley, the one who was always writing the letters, he looked at them and he said, I want to be a part of that one. I want to be a part of that regiment. They were the first. They're so famous. And he asked to be transferred, so he was. And I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes that I have, oh, good, I think I got plenty of time. I want to dive down a little bit into the South. We're moving into the South now because we're going to follow these Langley soldiers down south a little bit, especially Loudon Langley, because he's the one at the end of the war who decided to stay in Beaufort, South Carolina for the rest of his life. He stayed down there. So we're going to follow them down there, and we're going to look at his life a little bit during Reconstruction, and then I'll be done. So after the war, we all know the North wins, everybody's emancipated, but then what happens next? Often in school, I don't know if it happened to you, but it's definitely happened to me. We get to the end of the Civil War, the North wins, yay. Now let's go talk about the Progressive Era. About all those years in between. What was going on those years? Well, one of the things that was going on was Reconstruction. There was a presidential Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson, while Congress wasn't in session, decided he was just going to pardon all the Confederates, give them back all their land. They can all come back and take their seats in Congress again. When Congress got back in session, they said, no way, that's not happening. And they said that every single Confederate state had to rewrite their constitution and be accepted by the United States in order to come back into the Union. So this is a picture here of the 1868 South Carolina biracial constitutional convention. All these constitutional conventions were biracial throughout the South. They were biracial. Think of all those constitutions that were written during this time are still the constitutions of those states. And they were written by biracial legislatures. So here we have 1868 radical Republicans. Yes, they used to be radical. Maybe they still are. Anyway, so I'm looking at the delegates to this. And these are some of the South Carolina delegates. And I get to Beaufort, South Carolina. Look who's there. L.S. Langley. Loudon Schubel Langley. That's his name, named after his grandfather. He's a representative, and they talked about him in the newspapers a lot. They said he was loud-mouthed about justice. I love that part. And he did. He talked a lot about, he was really interested in the laboring man. He said the labor of people is their only wealth, of the laboring man, and he really wanted to protect that. So, and he really wanted everybody to be educated, equal education. So he was definitely loudmouthed about justice. And I don't know, does anybody know who Robert Smalls is? He was with Robert Smalls in the delegation. Robert Smalls is a huge Civil War hero in South Carolina. He has a great story. Just write that name down, Robert Smalls, and look him up afterwards. They were actually neighbors. They lived next to each other in South Carolina, which is fascinating. So for 12 years, they worked on Reconstruction. After they wrote their constitutions, they worked on Reconstruction. They didn't get any help from the federal government. The states had to raise taxes in order to reconstruct their states. So this is where the whole anti-tax thing started, because the former Confederates didn't want to pay taxes to help black people. No way, we're not paying those taxes, but they had to. But so for 12 years, they reconstructed the South. Here's Thomas Miller talking about, we built schoolhouses, we established charitable institutions, we maintained the penitentiary system, we provided for the education of the deaf and dumb, rebuilt the jails and the courthouses. In short, we had reconstructed the state. Now, it wasn't all they did. They rebuilt the railroads, they rebuilt the roads, they rebuilt bridges. They reconstructed the South in 12 years. It wasn't easy. It was really hard because they had to fight against the former Confederates the entire time that they were doing this. And these were biracial governments. So Loudon Langley wasn't only at that convention. He was on the school board back in Beaufort. He became the first superintendent of schools in Beaufort, South Carolina. They didn't have a school system before the Civil War. He was the first, and he was black. He became the auditor for the town. He was an election official. He, according to Eric Foner, who's like the Reconstruction guru in the country, he was a founding father of radical republicanism that did reconstruct the South. The next slide I'm going to show you is a little tough, but I think it's something that we need to face in this country. We need to face not just those high points, but we need to face the low points too. And the next picture is a little tough. Could have been a lot tougher, I tell you. So the whole time that they're trying to reconstruct the South, they're fighting against the former Confederates. They build schools, the Confederates burn them down. They terrorize families, they break into homes, they rape the women. They don't rape the women because the women are trying to vote. They rape the women because their husbands are trying to vote. And it will terrorize them and keep their husbands from voting. And people who do vote, what happens to them? They get tortured. They get murdered. They get burned to death, with crowds watching and cheering and eating picnic lunches. It's hard, but we have to face that. We have to face this part. You can't leave that out, or you don't understand what's going on in our history. So this is really the lowest point. This is the nadir. This is 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes is elected president, and there's a big problem with who actually won that election. But he says, well, if you let me, he won by one electoral vote. He said, in the South, people in the South said they were going to ride on Washington and they were going to, resist the election. And so they all got together, they had a discussion. Hayes said, I won by one. Let me take the presidency and I will leave the South to you. You can have your states' rights back, and the federal government will not have anything to do with civil and human rights. That will be a state's issue. So that happened in 1877. Everything that was happening in the previous slide kept happening through Jim Crow. That's the history of Reconstruction. Loudon Langley didn't live very long after this. He lost all of his jobs because he was a black man. But his friend, Robert Smalls, asked the president to give him a federal position. So he got this federal position, which was an assistant lighthouse keeper in Hunting Island. He had a very bad back. He had had an injury during the war, and it was not a good job for a guy who, had a bad back, and bringing oil cans up and down that wasn't good for him. The people who were with him when he died said that's really the reason that he died, because of that job. So 1881, he dies. His gravestone says he was Sergeant Major. That was the highest that any black man could attain at that time. And he's in the Beaufort National Cemetery, along with his brother Lewis, who died at Hilton Head. So 2 of those farmers from Hinesburg down in Beaufort in the National Cemetery. There was also a teacher from Peacham who's down there, and she's buried there too. I have a feeling they may have all known each other. I have one more slide, and I just want to connect everything that we just talked about to today. So this is my last slide, which I could spend a couple hours on, but let's just suffice it to say that what I've done here is I've taken, so this lowest point, this backlash against Reconstruction, I think we're still in that era. I don't think we've gotten out of it yet. Because take a look at this. I mean, during the backlash, there was a whole states' rights versus, federal, right? The Confederates wanted the federal government out of their affairs. And today's the same thing. There we go. Good. I did 40 minutes instead of 45. So I just wrapped this up. So the same thing happened back in the old days is happening today. I mean, we still got the Confederate flag flying everywhere. Why is that? And this stuff started in 1865. This stuff started as soon as the war was over. The Confederacy got control of textbooks. They had committees where they created the textbooks. They called them mint julep textbooks. They said, children in the South should never be taught that the Confederacy did anything wrong. And they made sure that the textbooks said that. And they made sure that the curriculum said that. They very tightly controlled what kids were reading. Anything like that happening today? Voting rights limitations. I don't think we're burning bodies anymore, but we're kneeling on their necks, right? No. So anyway, and all sorts of voting rights limitations are coming now. Cries of socialism. The Confederates said, "Oh my gosh, those people are all socialists." Sometimes they use the word communist. I mean, Marx was, had come out with his, theories by that time, and actually Lincoln was kind of interested in Marx's theories at one point. But a lot of these black folks, they didn't have a lot. They would pool their money together and buy land and farm it together. Had like insurance, little like insurance companies together. And Confederates look at it, ex-Confederates. Oh my gosh, socialism, communism, we have to get rid of them. And get rid of them they did. They burned down whole towns, bombed towns, kill people. They called them socialists. Oh my God. Does that ever happen today? Oh my God. Fears of domination. In the old days, they were really afraid of being dominated by African Americans. Today, I think we can throw in immigrants, right? Black and brown. If you're black and brown, we fear you. Peaceful protests are often called violent riots. Like after George Floyd, all those protests were 93% peaceful. But that's not generally what we heard from people. We heard, oh no, they're violent, they're horribly violent. There are signs up in the South that say things like 350 blacks were killed and 2 whites, and they call it a black riot, and that they had to get rid of the blacks after that because they had killed 2 white men. Whites are losing their rights. I'll just finish with that one. That's like, I just have to laugh at that one, but it's not funny, really. It's really happening. So I just want to remind you of this. We do have progress, but it looks like this. We have progress and then we go down. We cannot rest on our laurels. I think that's the real lesson here. once we have won some victory for humanity, don't go home and say, done, we got that. No, we don't. Revolutions go backwards. People lose their rights. So I think that's a real important, for me, it's a really important lesson in their story. So thanks, I'm done. I don't know what we want to do about that. We'll just leave it there, I guess. I'd be happy to answer questions or just listen to you if you want to comment.
Guess I've got the mic first here. You mentioned the 2 or 3 families in Heinsberg on Lincoln Hill. Were there others as well? Was it a much larger community? Or was it just these 2 or 3 families?
Well, it was the Clarks and the Peters, but they became very large extended families is what happened. Because, you know, as I said, whenever the kids got married, people seemed to come and stay on the hill. Same thing with the Peters. And they were surrounded by, you know, like 4 or 5 houses of different people.
And what eventually became of their descendants? Did any remain here? Do any still remain?
Yes, plenty of them. Plenty of the Peters. I've found Clark descendants, but they're all over the world and even in outer space. I can talk about one of them who went into outer space just a few years ago. The Peters tended to stay around, and when I first started researching, I didn't expect to find descendants either, but then these very white, blonde women came up to me one day and said, "Did you see this name in the census?" And I said, "Oh yeah, he's descended from them." And they said, "Oh, then we are too." It had been hidden in their family. They weren't allowed to know that they had been descended. And they were descended from Prince Peters, a Revolutionary War veteran. Why aren't they proud of that, right? Should be proud. But it was a protective move. There were people, if you can become white, then you have a lot more chance of, you know, doing well in this world. So it was this protective move. I think I'm supposed to be waiting for the microphone. Is that right?
We've got one over here. I'll be back.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My question is about.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah. Question is about the situation with regard to indigenous populations in Vermont at that time. When I was working at the health department a number of years ago, I met somebody who was, interestingly, his descendants were both Abenaki and African American. Was there any intersection with the Abenaki and other indigenous people in Vermont with this family?
Yeah, absolutely. They're actually, I don't have any proof for this, but there's talk in the families that Violet Bassett was an Abenaki. And there's also talk that Hannah Lensman, Prince Peter's wife, was an Abenaki. So and there was another woman, Josephus Peters was second generation. He married a woman by the name of Charlotte, and they think she was Abenaki. And I actually think I might have a little proof about her because she's buried in the middle of this white cemetery. There's her grave. I'm like, why is she here? Why was she allowed to be here, but everybody else is, you know, up on the hill somewhere? Maybe she was. Maybe she was Abenaki. Maybe her skin color made it better. So there's a lot of that. I mean, at one time, if you could run away from your slaveholder and get to native people's lands, you were free. So there was a lot of that going on, you know, and they were all kinds of laws making it illegal. If you're enslaved, you can't be, you know, a mile away from your enslaver or you're going to get arrested and thrown in jail. But there was a lot of movement toward living with native peoples because you would be free. Yeah.
Hi. Your last slide reminded me of a book that I have not read, but I may want to read. It's Heather Cox Richardson's book, How the South Won the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Have you read it? Or
I haven't read that one. I've read similar ones, yeah. They won it through the pen and the noose. That's how they won it. rewriting history and the news, or whatever form of lynching that you use. Lynching is just a term for extrajudicial killings, right? They did it a lot of different ways. It wasn't just the news. There was a lot of different ways.
Anyone else? Did I miss anyone? Okay,
There's one
I'm
up here.
coming. Raise your hand. Is it you?
Yes,
Yeah.
thanks. I understood that there was a Prince family in Heinsberg. Is that didn't happen?
Yeah, the question is that she thought that there was a Prince family in Heinsberg. There was a Prince family, and I found him, I'm trying to remember his first name now. This is Prince family with Prince as the last name. They were from St. Albans. There are a lot of princes up in St. Albans, and one of them ended up as a farm laborer for a white family on Lincoln Hill. So there's some connections there. To me, it was amazing. And one of the guys, Josephus Peters, married somebody from St. Albans. It was amazing to me, the networks. They're Pittsford, St. Albans, Dorothy's Kingdom. There was a network. They were meeting each other, finding each other, and marrying each other. I don't quite understand it, but it existed. Yeah.
My question has to do with voting. In that pre-Civil War time where you showed us the families that established the two clans, so to speak, and you just now minutes ago referred to free blacks coming and going in that area, the general area. Turning to voting, if they showed up to vote, whatever the status of regulations were affecting that, could they vote?
Yes, they all voted. I see all these men going to vote. I mean, basically, you'd go to the town clerk's office and you take the oath, right? And they allow you to vote. So I can see them, in both state and national elections, they were voting because their names were always checked off on the voting lists.
Anyone else? No? Elise, this was great. Thank you very, very
Okay.
much.
Thank you. You want to see the woman who went into space? She's right there. This is Loudon Langley and Jane's daughter who moved to Ohio, married Harry Proctor, and this is their great-great-great-granddaughter, Sion Proctor. And she just a couple of years ago went up into space. She piloted a spaceship in outer space. A direct descendant of Jacob and Dinah, right? She's piloting. She's fascinating. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.